So, as per usual, I don't have a plan for this talk. Sometimes I do. It kind of comes to me before the talk, but often I don't at all. So, so I start talking about something that is what I always talk about, what I always point to, and it's not a thing. And it's right here. It's right here for all of us. It's nothing the mind can grasp or get a hold of. And that's the first barrier we come into contact with in this whole endeavor. And there are different terms for that: awakening, or in Zen, it might be called the gateless barrier or the gateless gate. A lot of these are historical references, but they are relevant in that the first river you cross, or the first shift that occurs, has to do with a very profound transformation in what we take ourselves to be. It's also a profound transformation in the way we engage beliefs, thoughts, and concepts, and conclusions, and judgments. We see far more clearly that all of those are not our identity. They're not what we are. They don't define us. They don't define experience. If anything, they reflect experience. And this may not be exquisitely clear in the way I'm describing it right away. It took me a long time to see it clearly, but instinctually, you know damn well something has changed. So there's a fluidity, a natural fluidity that becomes very obvious. It's remembered. It's so real. It's so fundamental to just aliveness that it's not something we feel like we've acquired or even reacquired. It's just like something else that was seemingly obscuring it stops happening. That's that first shift. And it really does have to do with this dropping away of this belief that we're going to somehow find truth through mind, through thought, through belief. My Zen teacher used to have a saying, if you think you can find your way out of suffering with thought, with beliefs, with concepts, he'd say, come into the Dokusan Room and we'll mix it up. Dokusan Room is where you have a private conversation with your teacher. So to start from the beginning, this is what I always point to. It's right here in our experience. But the first thing that we know about it distinctly and clearly, the first thing we realize about it, what it is I'm talking about or pointing to, is that you'll never get there with thoughts. You'll never get there through conceptualization or understanding in the usual way we understand things. There's never going to be a satisfying paradigm that will be equivalent to awakening for you. It just won't happen. You might find satisfying paradigms, satisfying ways of thinking about life or yourself or realization, but they aren't experiential insight. They're not equivalent to waking up to truth. So part of what we do on retreat is continue to disidentify from thoughts, from concepts, from conclusions about ourselves, our lives, about realization. And we start to notice that we're not disidentifying or letting go from these concepts and positions and conclusions so that we can settle into a different kind of conclusion or view or frame of reference. We're letting go because it's natural. So the letting go is an end in and of itself. But this isn't always obvious at first. Because, as I mentioned, there will be shifts in identity that feel like distinct events. And in one sense, they are. In the relative sense, they are. In the world of time and so forth, they seem to happen to someone. They seem to happen at a point in time. They seem to have defining characteristics. So when that occurs, that shifting occurs, and it occurs at various levels. There's almost always a tendency on the other side of it to reorient, maybe not conceptually, but emotionally, energetically, instinctually. There's something very, very deeply rooted in our identity that wants to know where it stands, wants to know how things are, how the world is, how I am, how you are, how our connection is, how our relationship is, how the rules of the universe operate. There's something in us that wants to find a footing there. And this is not conceptual thought in the way I was speaking before, as much as it's fundamental to conceptual thought. You could call it non-conceptual thought, perhaps, but it's really just a very fundamental operation of mind. And that is to say, first, I need to know how things are, and from there I can proceed. And what does the mind, in the way I'm speaking now, want to accomplish out of proceeding from a position? Well, it wants what it always wants. It wants to feel safe. It wants to know what is true and what's not true. It wants to discern. It wants to predict. But ultimately, underneath it all, it wants to feel peace. It wants to feel okay. We all want to feel okay. Now, what starts to happen as this process unfolds is we start to realize that this primary sense of wanting to feel okay, natural sense of wanting to feel okay, wanting to feel peace, wanting to know freedom as moment-to-moment experience, it causes a little friction with this sense that builds more and more. I don't know if it builds. It becomes clearer over time that ultimately we can't hold any position. We can't hold on to any specific view or frame of reference and not suffer. So we feel more and more as this unfolds that when I try to orient to reality in a certain way, however that is, there's some rigidity there, there's some fixation, and that fixation itself is really what's causing suffering. Now, this fixation can play out in all kinds of ways. It can play out in a fixation in the masculine, in the feminine, in the absolute, in the relative, in very common worldly ways. A fixation on having a perfect relationship, or having the right relationship, or being seen or heard or loved. It can be a fixation on the validation I think I need, fixation on safety, success, position, control, all these things we fixate on. But what this starts to come down to is that the nature of fixation itself, in the ways we're speaking about, which ends up being everything, because in the natural state, let's say, there's no fixation. And this is pointed to clearly in a lot of places. One is the Heart Sutra, where it describes the bodhisattva of compassion who's sundered all the bonds of suffering. And they find themselves in this place where they're free of delusive hindrance. That's when freedom is really known, and freedom and peace are really known. But up until that point, you will notice fixation coming and going at various times. Often it won't be clear what it is that's fixating or what's being fixated on. And yet you'll recognize the signature of fixation, of holding, of control. Again, this comes up in many different ways, pushing and pulling on our life experiences, trying to get more of this and less of that. Now, in a very practical, simple sense, we are, of course, inhabiting these body minds that will do that. They're going to like to eat certain things, and they're not going to want to eat things that are poisonous. And in reflection, we're going to notice that, and that's, of course, natural. But this isn't what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the incessant feeling of being someone behind the eyes and the head, the controller of experience, the manager and navigator of experience. It is actually doing the pushing and pulling, but it's actually not pushing and pulling on reality itself, because you can't. It's not actually possible. And that's frustrating to the ego. So what the ego does is dreams up a version of reality, convinces itself it is reality, and then pushes and pulls on that internally. That's what we feel. That's suffering. That's what we feel, this internal struggle, strife, discomfort, constant evaluation, judgments, mostly about ourselves, often about other people, but we're often projecting when we do that, or even about the world or life or God or the government or whatever we push and pull on. But it's really good news when we see, feel, and instinctually intuit that what we're really pushing on really is ourself. It's an inside job. So, and this is great news. This is really good news. That's why you can just sit. That's why I have total trust that you can just sit here for 4 days, even with no technique, and just eliminate distractions, just sit and feel, be, and it will take care of itself. Because it's right, you have everything you need. You have everything you need to realize fully this that I point to endlessly, that doesn't have a name, doesn't have an adequate description. It's not a paradigm. It's in a sense transcendent all the time. And in another sense, it's quite concrete and very much in front of your face. We all know it. We all sense it, or we wouldn't be here. And yet it can appear as if we are apart from it at times. And that feels like suffering. And the majority of that suffering is really just rooted in our own struggles with ourselves, that we've convinced ourselves. There's no guilty party. It's not, we didn't decide to do this, and we don't really knowingly do it. It's a habit force and it's made possible by the complexity of our minds. But we're ultimately struggling against the version of the world that we believe, the version of ourselves that we believe, the version of other people that we believe, the version of the rules of life that we believe, without examining closely, but we assume. And that assumption causes a sort of friction between what we expect, what we want, what we think we need, what we think should be there, and what actually is there. All of those things and what is happening. So what is happening, what is clear and obvious at any given moment, and if you forget how to access what's clear and obvious at any moment, just listen. Just feel. Just let that visual experience come through you, move into you. That's the reminder. It's really, really simple. That might open a gap in the thoughts for a half a second, but it matters. It's valuable. It's a reminder that this is what's actually happening. Anything that's happening in the mind is not really actually happening. It's a reflection. It's at best of a moment too late. At worst, 10 years off. We're thinking about imagining, concerning ourselves with beliefs we've had for years and years and years and years. Events that are long gone or events that may never happen, past, future. So these thoughts, these pulls into the internal world that is discordant with the direct experience of the sense world right now. They're not evil. There's no evil entity in you called an ego doing it. They're not insurmountable. They're really actually innocent. They're just thoughts. But when there's suffering associated with this and a recognition that it doesn't have to be this way, that there is an ability or a possibility to experience profound presence, then that's the tap on the shoulder. That's grace. And this is why suffering, in the way I'm defining it here, which is that discord, suffering is grace. Without that, we might just sort of remain semi-awake or partially asleep or whatever. So this acknowledgement of suffering or discontent is where we start often. This gets us on the path. That along with often a taste of some sort, something breaks through and happens all different ways, happens through tragedy, happens through psychedelic drug use more and more. It happens through meditative experiences. It happens through, it can happen completely spontaneously. It happens in nature. That taste, that flavor of unfiltered reality that you just can't, you can't mistake that for the inner world of thoughts. It just doesn't feel the same. It's beyond good or bad or beyond really knowing or unknowing. It's just what it is, but it's instinctually authentic. And so that, along with the prompting of suffering, this magical combination is what brings us into orientation with investigating deeper and deeper and deeper into our momentary experience, which really is what all of this comes down to. There are wonderful pointings, traditions, strategies, places, ashrams, Zen temples, online groups, wonderful descriptions by people who have gone through these transformations. All of that is out there. It's wonderful that it's out there. We have access to that now very easily. It's great. But never let that obscure the simple fact that what you need to wake up is right here, always right here. It's right here when we're in a concentrated meditative environment. It's right here when we're listening to a talk. It's right here when we're walking the dog. It's right here when we're feeling emotion. It's right here when we're feeling disorientation, confusion. The access point is still here, always. And that's really where I always approach any sort of teaching or reflecting or guided meditation or technique. It's really just about this. That again, from the beginning of this talk, I still can't say a single word about it. And yet I know every one of us knows what I'm pointing to. And it's not outside. It's not out there somewhere. So at first, or early in the journey, this can go all different ways. There's no right way for this to unfold, of course. But early in the journey, it often feels as if you have to manage conditions in a certain way to access this that we're talking about. And that means it tends to happen when you're meditating, or it tends to happen on retreat. Or again, it can happen randomly. but it feels like a special set of conditions that bring it about. It feels like a special occasion almost, or something you need to take extraordinary measures in your life to come into contact with, like purposely eliminating all the distractions, or developing a deep state of samadhi meditation. That's how it feels at first, and that's okay. Why that is doesn't really matter so much. But as things clarify, it starts to you start to notice that not only are these situations where it feels like you've cultivated the conditions for this to come forth, this presence, truth, etc., but it starts to also really come forth on its own spontaneously a lot more. It may not be there sort of all the time in your experience, but it just breaks through, and it can happen in all different conditions. So with this, there's a sort of maturity in the spiritual life, let's say, that is a recognition that I am not in control of what it is that brings forth presence in the way I thought I was, for sure. Sure, it seems like I can make a decision to go to a retreat or meditate or not meditate, or etc. But it can make a decision. I can make a decision about what practice I'm going to use. That's all fine, of course. But at some point, it just starts breaking through at very random times, times when you're not in deep meditation. Profound presence just comes on. The world slows way down. Everything becomes very, very close, very intimate. It's uncaused. You feel the uncaused nature, the fact that you didn't do anything for this to clarify itself in this immediate, is itself wonderful, because if it's freeing, it gets you off the hook. And it also starts to show you that, maybe I was never really in charge in the way I thought I was. That sure, we can till the soil and prepare the ground, but the fruition of presence, the fruition of clarifying, stopping, etc., is not. It is something very mysterious about it. It's not something you can just, flip a switch and cause in the ways that it seemed like before, even if flipping the switch meant to sit in retreat for a few days with a lot of pain. And then as things clarify even more, you realize very clearly that you really never caused any of it. And it's very strange, because the relative part of the journey is important. You can't just ignore suffering once you recognize it. You can't ignore the tastes of reality that have come upon you through grace. So you have to do what feels relevant to you. You have to take up a practice of some sort, or various practices. But again, at this point, at this stage of the game, at some point, you realize that was really just more thoughts. It was more mind. That there's something here going on, that's going on, that comes forward at times and just quiets the whole world, makes everything very clearly okay. It's always here. It's not, you can't have more or less of it. It's not in that world of the mind that judges how much, how little, how close, how far. It's not about that. It's sort of on the inside and the outside. It's right where you are when you feel like a self, and it's right there when that feels like there's no specific separate self. It's there when there's presence as satisfying, shimmering one taste, and it's there when there's presence as resistance to an emotion. It's always there. It's always here. And with this, we start to relax in a new way. Not the kind of relaxation that the mind or ego wants, like space to sit there and think and reconstitute itself. This is a very fundamental type of relaxation. It's a relaxation that's fully intertwined with letting go, with trust in life, in realization, but also seeing now at this stage, let's say, the realization isn't apart from life. It's not a special thing you do and compartmentalize your life, and then you have other parts of your life. It's always unfolding, and it's more powerful than you are. And it doesn't really concern itself too much with your agendas, with how you want this to unfold, how you want the spiritual process to unfold, the awakening process, let's say. It's not super concerned with how how you think it's supposed to look. And this becomes obvious. Things can get a little strange. It can get to the point where it's like the moment you make a conclusion, it blows up again and again and again, because it sort of has to. When you're really in fidelity with living truth, the world just starts looking very different. The ways we used to orient ourselves, which were about what's predictable, what I can control, what I can't control, what I like, what I don't like. We see that that's not how we're orienting anymore, whether we like it or not. How we're orienting now is to surrender. How we're orienting now is to a certain indeterminacy, which is like the last thing that our thought process wants or values. But as direct experience, as immediate experience, indeterminacy is so natural. It's so freeing. We could call it transient nature, more of a Buddhist term. Now, what's funny about this transient nature is the ever-changing connotation of it is true, but our minds might think of that a certain way, like I'm aware, standing apart from the flow of experience, watching it happen. But that's not the deeper experience of transient nature. The deeper experience of transient nature is it's much more intimate than that, because there isn't a standing apart, like there's not a watcher state or some vast awareness ground that is somehow aware of all the things in it or whatever. It's more like you just become fully whatever's happening right now, but it's also as it's happening, it's also changing and disappearing and reforming, and that with that you're changing, disappearing, and reforming, let's say. So it's the changingness, the natural changingness and spontaneity of reality, but you're not apart from it. It's intimate is the word I always come back to, because even that's really not a really great word for the actual experience, but it's important that aspect is there. It's not a dissatisfying, dysphoric, or it's not a dissociated type of experience at all. It's an immersion, just full immersion, a willing immersion. And the willingness really is because there's no other choice. There's no other way it could be. That's the clarity of equanimity, that this, as it's playing out, as it's happening right now, is, you could say it's just right or perfect or whatever, but still that's adding some sort of judgment. It's just what's happening. And it's very clear that as far as what's immediately happening, I can't make it a more comfortable way or less comfortable way. It's just how it is. Simple, quite simple, innocent. But you do sort of fall in love with that simplicity, that innocence, because it's natural, because it couldn't be any other way. So with this, it's hard to make a distinction between spirituality or the awakening process or realization and everything in life, like the just the momentary flow of experience, of appearances. They're not two things anymore. They're not, to say you have a practice doesn't make a lot of sense, because everything is practice or nothing is practice. But and yet we still speak in terms of that sometimes. So it's very paradoxical. Dogen called it practice enlightenment. It's like one term, practice enlightenment, very apt term. When you're practicing and you don't feel enlightened, you don't feel awake, there's just endless frustration sometimes, etc. That is enlightenment, because enlightenment isn't a conditional thing. It's just how it is. Again, Buddhist terminology, but that's why it's referred to as a dharma seal. Anatta, no self, transient nature, dharma seals. It's not a stage or something you're going to acquire. And really, it's not even something that you clarify. It's already clear. It's more of a stopping of activities that seem to hide it from you, from your experience. So that's the practice end of it, that even practice is enlightenment, because from the, I'm going to say view, although it's not a view, from the enlightened view, from the liberated view, there's no way for anything not to be part of liberation. People don't become enlightened. Enlightenment is. People don't become liberated. Liberation is. It just is. For everyone. It's just what it is. So a sort of Advaita way of saying it, or maybe Neo-Advaita, is that the one that felt apart from that, the one that felt like it was seeking that, ceases to be. But can an illusion really cease to be, or is it just that the lens shifts a little bit? So that's the sort of enlightenment end of it. But practice enlightenment, the phrase itself, is right on the money. You find yourself no longer needing to make any distinction between the conventional, just the usual way of speaking about life, circumstances, situations, people, all of it, problems, solutions, and realization. There's no need to make a distinction anymore, because really there is no distinction, never was, and never could be. So taking it off the mat, taking it off of the cushion, the meditating cushion, is a way of talking about this, but it tends to happen naturally. I'm not sure. You can, in certain ways, take it off the cushion intentionally, but in general, this is just the natural way this goes. It has to. I don't know how that comes across. I don't know how it sounds. If it sounds like a sort of romantic thing to happen, but I will tell you, there's quite a variation in how that's received when that starts to happen. If it's very abrupt and there's a lot of resistance, you can fight it a lot. You don't want to see that it's kind of like it's always on, the awareness of what's happening internally and externally. It's like the switch goes on and it doesn't go off. There's not really a way to escape it anymore. It's kind of like you've asked for it again and again and again, but you didn't quite realize what you were asking for until you got it. And then once you get it, you can't unget it. So it is wonderful. It is deeply peaceful. But for the part of us that wants to resist anything, it's in a sense devastating, because you can't resist non-resistance. You can't resist transient nature, not for long. So with that, is it good news? Is it bad news? It's a little hard to say. I thought Adyashanti has a really cool analogy I've heard him use once or twice, and says it's kind of like when you discover a celestial body, some beautiful planetary celestial body, or maybe something bigger like a large star, or a black hole or neutron star, who knows, some celestial body though, and you just get very interested, you're fascinated with it, you fall in love with it, and you want to get closer to it and investigate it. You get closer and closer, and then you start to feel the pull of the gravity. And then once the gravity has you, you've kind of crossed the point of no return. And by the time you realize that, it's like, whoa, 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 I didn't want this much of this. I'm not sure if I want it this full on, but guess what? The universe doesn't really concern itself too much with what the resisting part of you wants. It's not cold. I mean, there's this aspect of unconditional love that plays into all this as well. And what's interesting and paradoxical is the answer ends up being unconditional love, because that's the only place in the relative sense, in the relative world, unconditional love, that you're going to find true non-resistance in any possible situation. That doesn't mean that any person alive has gotten to a place where they never ever feel any resistance whatsoever, but at some point you know the formula, and that is the heart just has to continue to open. The ability to accept and ability to move fluidly has to continue to unfold, to the capacity continues to widen, and you could call this unconditional love. So this is what I point to. All of that talking I just did, all of the ways I described it, is not an it. It is just simply what I point to, what I talk about. It's actually what's making all this happen. With all those words and all those descriptions, it's still absolutely and exquisitely simple. It's right here. It has no specific characteristic, color, quality. It also does not doesn't avoid any characteristics or qualities, colors, shapes, forms. It's not defined by them. So in a very real sense, there's an evolution to this process for the individual, until even the sense of being an individual can actually collapse away, fall away, and has seemed to really have never been there. It was just a sum total of a lot of struggle. And all that evolution seems to happen, plays out. And at the same time, this still point, this unmoving stillness is just here. And it doesn't matter where you are on that spectrum, or if you're on that spectrum anywhere at all. It doesn't matter if you believe that you can progress your way to enlightenment step by step and filter by filter as you untie these dualistic knots and dissolve the perceptual filters, or if you believe that doing anything like that or doing any of that is really just reinforcing the sense of a seeker, reinforcing the sense of a self or a me. It doesn't matter which side you stand on that. None of that even matters either, because it's just this. It is this simple. It doesn't fixate in any spectrum or any side of any spectrum. So that really ends up being the best news of all, because it doesn't matter if you've left the driveway or if you've been on this road for 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. It doesn't matter if you're able to access unbound consciousness, pure sense of being easily, or you have no idea what that is. It doesn't matter. It's okay, because the truth is here. It's never been 1 millimeter apart from you, from the physical experience of being you, even from the thoughts, even from the thought stream, even from the unseen sense of being the thinker. All of it is perfectly okay. It's all just part of this display. So as I described in the book, you could almost say there are two, we could break it down this way, there are two general approaches to this, and everyone can touch into both of them at times. Some people tend far more towards one side than the other. And some stages of this realization or certain shifts as they occur tend to emphasize one side or the other more. But I'll break it down in maybe a different way than I did in the book a little bit here. One is this way of discernment, of sort of using the mind to overcome the mind, or using inquiry to dissolve the perceptual mechanisms that make reality feel and look divided all the time. It's, what is it, like using a splinter to get out a splinter, that sort of thing, turning the mind on itself. This is a good approach. It's a very powerful approach. And at times, it's really, I think, what you have to do at certain times. Other times, or let's just say there's this whole other way of moving, which is the way of mystery, the way of wonder, the way of awe. And that is to acknowledge that this really, really, really is a mystery. It's mysterious. This right now, it's mysterious. Can you turn your attention back and look upon yourself? Never seen anybody able to do it yet, but trying is valuable. We can't even find ourselves, but we believe we can know about all of these aspects of reality, of realization, of thought, emotion. We can't even find the one that refers to. So in a certain sense, that makes it quite mysterious. So the question is, are you all right with mystery? Are you all right with, it's a sort of sublime mystery? This space is really where you find the signature of resistance. You recognize it, because when we acknowledge the mystery of life, the mystery of this right now, resistance is laid bare, because it has nothing to push on anymore. We don't run into the mind to try to orient ourselves, to try to know, because that is one thing that our thought system does pretty well, is convinces itself it knows. It's always relative knowledge, right? It's always knowing in relation to something else. And all of that knowing is in relation to the thinker, the unseen thinker, the subjective pull, which continues to cause that sense of separation. So it's an illusion, but it does, the mind is good at that. It's good at orienting itself. But once we've seen that that's not really going to quench the thirst for truth, not at the deepest level, then when we acknowledge the mystery, this mystery, when we stand in a sort of wonder, it's almost binary. There's either just terror or there's total surrender and innocence. Really, I mean, there are not many other ways you can go here, because everything else in between is a thought, a belief, an assumption. So this part of things, this wonder, is so important in your unfolding, to acknowledge it in one way or another at some point or another, and however that feels the most relevant to you. Listen to I hear wind outside now. Listen to the wind, listen to the weather, listen to the hum. Do you really know what that is when you don't think about it and thoughts are learned? But that, the actuality of it, where do you reference to know what that is when you only reference that? There's a certain mystery to that, and it's fine. It's good that there is. It's wonderful. The mystery is something like this: when I don't stand apart, how can it be anything or nothing? How can it be specific or generalized? How can it be here or there? Again, referring directly to the experience, to the sound, to a sensation, same thing. There's endless wonder in the senses once the mind calms down to a certain degree. Endless. If we just trust it, if we just trust that that's the signature of aliveness. That's our body minds are antennas to reality. And that interface, when we don't construct artificially a feeler, a seer, or a hearer, and there's just seeing, feeling, and hearing. That's all there is. No sides to that. No inside or outside, no subjective or objective pole. So then the mystery, to say it's a mystery is really that's just an entry point. We can just drop that too. And there's just that sound. The sound of sounds. The sound of one hand. You don't need anything more than that. It'll solve everything. It'll right the ship. But you got to go to it. You got to trust it. Let it teach you the language of unfiltered reality, which is not a describable language. It's not a language in words. It's not a language it's not a symbolic language. Symbol is something you need when you're not in direct contact. You've never been out of direct contact with this. So all symbols can disappear. All knowings, positions, evaluations can disappear into this immediacy of aliveness. So the takeaway, I guess, if there is one, is no matter how confused or lost or disoriented, or how oriented you actually do feel because you're so in thought, no matter what any of that's happening, whether or not any of that's happening, you always have immediate access. Just feel anything in the body. Feel it. Drop your attention in and just stay there. Just hear, just hearing, no hearer. That is presence. You don't need to cultivate it. You don't need to meditate for 3 days to hear, just hear. And it will get more and more and more clear. The senses end up being our salvation, really.